Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes. We're just letting everyone arrive. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you all to a webinar titled Psychoanalysis and Artificial Intelligence. I'm personally excited for this discussion, not only because AI is an interesting topic on its own, but also because it allows us to consider more deeply what it is to be human and what it means to be a psychoanalyst. I'm Dr. Nicole Zapian. I'll be your moderator for today's session. And before we start, I'd like to give you some information about how we structure things and how we're going to proceed. This webinar is an activity of the IPA Communications Committee under the direction of Mariano Rupertuz Honorato, chair of the Scientific Subcommittee of the Communications Committee. The Communications Committee is headed by Sylvia Weinbuch. Today's session will be recorded so that those who cannot attend real time and who have registered will be able to watch the video later. As an aside, I'd like to mention that all discussions of clinical material should not take place during today's webinar, simply because it is recorded and will be posted to YouTube later. You will receive a link if you're signed up, and the video will be accessible on YouTube as well. The structure of today's session, let me introduce myself, excuse me. I am the founder and host of a podcast titled Technology in the Mind, where I interview psychoanalysts and technologists about their ideas about consumer technology and AI and how it may be impacting our minds, relationships, and society. I'm also an advanced candidate at PINC, also known as the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California, as well as a member of PINC's Ethics Committee, the co-chair of PINC's Visiting Scholar Committee, the co-chair of APSA's Committee on Public Information, and a member of the IPA Communications Committee. I've published 2 books and several articles on topics as wide-ranging as ethics, sexual consent dynamics, infidelity, and consumer technology. Okay. So the structure of this session is as follows. I'll introduce each of the 3 presenters, and each one will speak for approximately 10 minutes. After all 3 have concluded their remarks, I'll facilitate a small discussion between them. Thereafter, we'll address your questions and comments, and the speakers will respond to you. Before we begin, I want to clarify a few things about this. First of all, the speakers' opinions are not their own. They are not institutional positions of the IPA. Next, if you have questions or comments to make at any point, even including right now, you can find the Q&A button, which looks like it does in the slides, down in the bottom of the Zoom screen. Simply click that button, pose your question, and we will capture these questions and answer them in the dialogue section of our session today. You'll note that closed captioning is available. It is noted also in the bottom of the Zoom tray. It's a little button that says CC for closed captioning. If you click that button, subtitles will be made available. You will note also that the microphone and chat features have been disabled. We are a large group, so we invite you to offer questions and comments through the Q&A feature in the bottom of your screen. The webinar is exciting today because of its timing and its importance, and it's been in planning for some time. I'd like to thank my colleagues in advance for their contributions and work to make this happen. And I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker. Dr. Fernando Castrillon. He's a PsyD, a practicing personal and supervising analyst. He's faculty of the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California, a licensed clinical psychologist, professor emeritus at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and the founder of the Foundation of California Psychoanalysis. Dr. Castrillon is editor-in-chief of the European Journal of Psychoanalysis and a member of the Istituto Elvio Facinelli Institute of Advanced Studies of Psychoanalysis based in Rome. He serves on various editorial boards, is the co-editor of 2 books, and is the author of numerous articles in Spanish, German, Italian, Russian, and English. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fernando Castrillon.
Thank you. So the title of my talk is Shredding Subjectivities. So generative artificial intelligence, ascertaining veracity in the future of a delusion. And I'd like to thank Nicole Zapian Mariano Rupertus Honorato, and the IPA for this kind invitation to speak with you here today. And a hearty thank you to all the attendees and my fellow panel members. Okay, if we begin with the premise that at the very least, nearly all recent psychoanalytic publications have availed themselves of generative artificial intelligence, and I put that in quotes, and you'll see why later. And here, generative artificial intelligence is any type of AI system capable of generating text, images, or other media in response to user prompts. Then we will have said both nothing new if we realize that most recent psychoanalytic publications have availed themselves of AI. We will have said both nothing new, and we will have provoked a worthwhile and necessary rupture with certain fictions we hold dear. With few deliberate exceptions, we are all now caught in the rapture of the machine. To wit, some small portion of this text that I'm reading today was composed nearly automatically by my word processor, feeding me ideas on how to end my sentences, otherwise known as predictive text, based on my previous compositions, that of others, and the programming of its engineers. Again, nothing new. This AI creep is something we are dimly aware of, even if we don't want to think about it too much. In fact, what I would offer is that generative AI, even at this relatively simple level, like predictive text, let's say, is explicitly designed to help us think less about everything, including our writing. However, the ante has been radically raised with the advent of more recent large language model chatbots, like ChatGPT, capable of generating extensive, systematic, and internally coherent texts. As submissions arrive at the offices of the European Journal of Psychoanalysis, of which I am an editor-in-chief, how are we to determine the provenance of any given text? Again, some portion of it was most certainly machine written, just like this talk. But what if the entire text was machine generated, or substantial pieces of it, if only to add flourish and finish? Surely we could tell the difference, right? As it turns out, we sometimes cannot. You just try it for yourself. Sign up with ChatGPT or any of the other myriad number of chatbots scurrying into view, and ask it to compose an essay on the political works of Alfred Kessler in the style of Gabriela Mistral. The results go beyond mimicry. Judge for yourself. Now, I should hasten to add that I certainly do not think that generative AI is indeed smart or intelligent in the way humans are. And I categorically disagree with the delusional notion that generative AI is conscious or even self-aware. And yet, writing, and I put this in quotes, writing produced by these machines born of enormous computing power, access to nearly infinite data sets, and simultaneous and instantaneous learning across bots are original texts of a kind. How are we to treat them? What do they portend for speech and language? And how do they enter, if at all, into the domains of psychoanalytic writing and symbolic exchange? I will grant that these questions seem somewhat preposterous, but we must ask them, or others will answer them for us. Now, our answers are not immediately forthcoming. It might be some time before we can even begin to provide a response adequate to the concerns at hand. It could be that we never even get to do so. But again, it is vital to formulate our questions now to stem the machinic onslaught even for a bit, so as to find some kind of footing in the midst of these digital torrents. Towards that end, I do want to mark the advent of these latest iterations of generative AI as a watershed moment. We have now gotten to the point where we, including the generative AI programmers themselves, simply do not entirely understand what these bots are doing, what they might be capable of executing in the near term, especially if they are more intimately paired with other systems such as financial markets, war machines, and utility infrastructures, and what the impact on human thought and practices will be. If we bear in mind the unabashed avarice and greed of Silicon Valley outfits that are leading the generative AI charge, the future looks ghastly indeed. And I should note, I live in the Bay Area in California, so I'm right next to Silicon Valley. Some might regard my thoughts on this as alarmist. At this point, the only retort I could give to that contention would be to ask, what else would it take to sound the siren at this point? It is now the case that our capacity to establish or ascertain veracity is impaired on at least two fronts. One, we are increasingly less capable of determining the factual truth of anything that is written or reported. Two, it is becoming progressively more difficult to determine the derivation of any supposed statement of fact. Where did it come from? To put it together, it is getting damn difficult to determine who or what wrote a thing or said a thing and whether that something is factually accurate or not. Without these two faculties, where are we? Some might like to float in the indeterminacy of the realms we're hyper catapulting into at this point. But psychoanalysis as a field demands something of a different order. This is not to say that facts are what analyses are made of, quite the contrary. But the field itself, via its manifold forms of literature and modes of transmission, does need to ascertain veracity in different and complex ways. This is now in serious jeopardy. Going further, this AI revolution provokes impacts in at least two other areas, the social and the subjective. In terms of the social, it strikes me that an inability to ascertain veracity is corrosive in that it allows all of us to fall further back into our echo chambers of trusted sources. Because anything outside of that restricted realm is simply not to be believed. As we well know, for all its computing power, generative AI is incredibly inaccurate. This is a perennial and structural issue with AI that developers have yet to correct, even as the newest versions of chatbots and the like were released last week to great fanfare. To put it simply, we cannot yet believe what AI tells us. When faced with this sort of anxiety-provoking social media landscape, we retreat to that we can be sure of, and more importantly, to that which we want to believe. The end result, of course, is that no one talks to anyone else anymore outside of their bubble. Or better yet, we don't listen to each other any longer. This is the death of social intercourse. But this shredding of the social field is necessarily accompanied, of course, by a kind of shredding of the subjective. Here I am referring directly to the psychoanalytic clinic. This matter of the inability of ascertaining veracity has grave consequences for the transference and for the status of the analytic interpretation. While some of us might imagine that the power of the transference might itself be diluted by the inability to ascertain veracity more generally, which will undoubtedly happen, I would also suggest the opposite. If anything, I could see the transference becoming a kind of singular space of truth, outside of the morass of innuendo, half-truths, and intentional disinformation campaigns brought to our doorstep by generative AI. But what does it do to hold a transference in this way, as a kind of lifeline in an otherwise decimated social field? I think here of interminable analyses, of psychoanalysis as a permanent refuge, as opposed to embodying a time-limited space of reflection, inquiry, in creation, eventuating in an invention, that of leaving the couch so as to enter the social field again, but positioned otherwise. To put it differently, how do analyses properly end when they operate in a social field invaded by the vagaries and inaccuracies generated by AI and related techno practices? And what are the psychoanalytic interpretation? In the best of cases, a good interpretation functions to provoke the analyst, to make them think, to connect seemingly disparate aspects of their subjective experience. An excellent interpretation is a challenge that, if taken up properly, leads to its being replaced by a truth provided by the analyst. The danger with any interpretation is that it is believed or taken as the truth of things, instead of it functioning as a catalyzing agent, spurring the analyst to speak more, to reveal more. This danger becomes all the more real within a social regime dictated by inaccuracy and the inability to ascertain veracity. The words of the analyst, taking place within the transferential moment already plagued by the concerns I mentioned before, become not oracular in nature, but scripture, the only thing that can be believed. I end my reflections on the question of the lie. It takes the unconscious to lie, to intentionally speak a non-truth. To my knowledge, there is no way of programming that into a chatbot as of yet. Generative AI may blur the line between a lie and the always fraught effort at truth-speaking, but at least for now, lying is solely the reserve of humans. At least we have that. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Castrillon. I knew this would be interesting. You've given us a lot to consider, not only in the scope of your talk, but I have many questions that are percolating. I want to remind everyone that if you too have questions and comments at this time or at any time during our session today, you're welcome to add them to the Q&A so that we have them when we get to that portion of our meeting. Next, I'm going to invite Dr. Luca Possati to give his talk, and I'd like to introduce him. Dr. Luca Possati is a philosopher whose research concerns the historical, ethical, and social implications of quantum technologies, with a particular focus on AI. Luca conducts research at Delft University of Technology and the School of Freudian Psychoanalysis in Milan, as well as lecturing at the Melbourne Center of Continental Philosophy. He's previously served as researcher and lecturer at institutions including the University of Porto, the Institut Catholique de Paris, and the Fonds Ricoeur, EHESS. I'm not sure if that's correct, but I hope I'm doing it justice, Dr. Possati. He received his PhD in the history of philosophy and the history of ideas, and his MA in philosophy, both from the Sapienza University of Rome. Luca's publications include the books Software as Hermeneutics, a philosophical and historical study, published by Palgrave, and The Algorithmic Unconscious, How Psychoanalysis Helps in Understanding AI. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Luca Possati.
Hello, nice to meet you. Can I share some slides?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, can you see my slides? Can you see the slides? Sorry.
I see them. I'm assuming
Okay.
everyone else.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me here. So, first of all, I would like to say something about the question, which is at the core of what we're talking about. What are the good questions, and what should we work on when we talk about the relationship between psychoanalysis and artificial intelligence? I think that the first point is to focus on the right question. And I think that we can start from these questions. Why view technology through the lens of psychoanalysis, but on the other hand, why view psychoanalysis through the lens of technology? What does it mean? Well, at the core of my research, there is first the question, how should we conceptualize the relationship between the unconscious mind and technology? So my problem is how the unconscious mind transforms and develops in a technological environment, and especially in a high technological environment, in a digital technological environment characterized by high complex forms of technology. So how is the human unconscious altered in a technological context, particularly through interactions with artificial intelligence, data mining, and biotechnology? But there is also another question. Does digital technology unveil new dimensions of the unconscious? I think that in order to better conceptualize this question, we have to rethink the human mind and the relationship between human mind, the environment, and artifacts. So the question is, what is the connection between the human mind and today's pervasive and ubiquitous forms of technology, such as AI? And how should we rethink drive, desire, and affectivity in relation to machine? As you can see, I don't think that the right question is, do this kind of machine have a form of unconscious or some drives, some affects, etc. I think that the right question is how our unconscious, our feelings and our drives are transformed by the interaction with this machine. If desire is the central category, and then we acknowledge that everything in the machine and in another essential concept, information, is influenced by desire, then we must ask what is desire in relation to the machine and information. So in one of my last book, I tried to answer this question through the concept of projective identification. And I identified projectional identification as the unconscious root of artificial intelligence. In this way, I also gave a reinterpretation of the classical Bion's model of projective identification, and I tried to extend projective identification on artifacts. As you can see, according to one of the most important interprets of projective identification, well, projective identification is an unconscious process, but it's also a type of defense against distressing content, a way of communicating, and then a primitive form of object relationship, and a path toward psychological transformation, that is the maturity of individuals. So projective identification is, first of all, a way that the baby uses in order to cope with distressing contents, but it is at the same time a way of communicating, a way of interacting with its mother, but also with the environment, in order to transform itself, in order to transform its mind, in order to transform the relationship between his mind and his body. And this form of unconscious mechanism of communication is something that develops with our personality. And then I tried to extend this to our relationship to the artifacts. There is an unconscious form of communication with the artifacts. We tend to project our needs, our desires, our drives on the artifacts, and specifically on artificial intelligence. And why specifically artificial intelligence? Because artificial intelligence is not just an artifact like a hammer or something else. It's something that is able to answer, to give us an answer based on a sort of creative behavior. Anyway, I identified 4 forms of projective identification, from humans to machine, from humans to humans, from machine to humans, but also from machines to machines. Anyway, let's try to be a little bit more concrete. What do I mean when I talk about the transformation of the unconscious mind in a technological environment? What do I mean when I claim that technology can impact on human mind and human mind can impact on technology? Well, I would like to share with you a case I'm working on, which is about grief boats, dead boats, and the relation between technology and mourning. This new form of technologies that are used with the loss of a beloved person. For example, let's talk about Project December. Project December is a service by using which you can create basically a chatbot based on the data of that person, all the data you can collect from internet, from social networks, etc. And then you can create a chatbot, which is basically based on the personality, which aims at reflecting the personality of the dead person. And then you can simulate chats with this bot. We can simulate the experience of talking with a dead person, talking with someone who is not alive. Anyway, I interviewed 20 people who used this service for about 3 months. And the results were very interesting. First of all, the first interesting element was a kind of split. The chatbot is simultaneously perceived in 2 ways. On the one hand, as just a machine, a pure fiction, almost like a game. On the other hand, as something real, something very serious, representing an authentic presence and a genuine connection with the deceased. But as you can see here, I reproduce some parts of basically the statement from the interviewed people. So, for example, the first person says that on the one hand, I knew it was all fake, just a machine trained with data. On the other hand, the fiction I was experiencing felt real. There was a part of me that actually believed it was my father and that I was really talking to him. So this person created a chatbot, a deadbot, based on his father's personality. Another interesting element is that this split between basically an hallucinatory content and the experience of reality created new spaces in order to explore the unconscious. What do I mean by this? Basically, there was the resurfacing of elements of the unconscious. The use of this technology and the strong emotions it evokes led to the resurfacing of forgotten or repressed memories. This means that, thanks to this split, to this kind of contradictory experience, on the one hand, people were completely aware that the deadbot was just a machine, was just something, just a software based on mathematical patterns. On the other hand, the desire to talk with that person was so strong that the first perception of the reality was overcome in order to create a kind of real contact with the beloved person, with the dead person. And you can see as this split created a new space in which forgotten memories could be remembered. For example, and I quote again some of the interviewed people, I remember the way my mother would come while cooking, the sound of her laughter, and even the smell of her favorite perfume. I remembered my brother and I building a tree house when we were kids, a memory I had completely forgotten. So I think this is very interesting because when we can talk about the relationship between the unconscious of the technology, understanding how technology can shape the unconscious, but also how technology can reveal new dimensions of the unconscious, in this case, unconscious memories. I think it's one of the core elements in this exploration of the relationship between unconscious and technology. And in this case, you can see how the use of this kind of technology in these people could create the conditions in order to remember forgotten memories. So thank you so much for this time. I hope it was interesting. Thank you so much.
Wow. Okay, I'm sort of really struck by this grief bot. I'm a little bit haunted by it and also fascinated. I'm assuming everyone else is too. Psychoanalysis also deals in forgotten memories and repressed memories. So there's some interesting connections. Thank you so much for your talk, and I'm sure we will explore it more. Our last presenter, Dr. Leora Trube, is going to finish up our formal presentations, and I'd like to introduce her. Dr. Leora Trube is a practicing psychologist based in New York City, where she works with adolescents, adults, and couples. She's associate professor of psychology in the school and clinical child PsyD program at Pace University. At Pace, she also founded and runs the Digital Media and Psychology Lab, which explores how technologies affect our conceptions of ourselves and our relationships with others, as well as the underlying psychological and emotional needs they meet. Recent projects include a qualitative study of the perspectives and experiences of psychoanalytic clinicians on the impact of technology on psychotherapy practice, and the development of an app aimed at increasing mindfulness during text-based interactions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leora Trube.
Thank you, Dr. Zapian. And thank you, Dr. Passati and Dr. Castrillon, for your comments. They're sort of swimming in my head as I begin. Look forward to our chat. 15 years ago, as a new academic, I undertook my first research project. I aimed to develop an app that would help people be more mindful and less impulsive when sending text messages. The project was inspired by a clinical interaction with a 17-year-old patient. She was relaying a text message sent to her by a boy with whom she occasionally hooked up and whom she liked more than just a friend. At 11 p.m., he texted, "Hey, how did you respond?" I asked. "Well," she said, "I waited 6 minutes." Seeing my quizzical look, she quickly explained that 6 minutes is the right amount of time to prevent seeming too eager. "And then?" I asked. Then I texted back, "Hey." I thought for a moment and I asked her, "Well, what did you do in those 6 minutes?" "I waited," she said, an obvious answer to a silly question. But for me, it was a bit of an epiphany moment. 6 minutes is a really long time. So I asked her, "Well, what would you have done with those 6 minutes had we been together and discussed it?" In response, it took her far less than 6 minutes to identify a better way to respond that took account of the fact that she wanted something quite different from him than he wanted from her. With this and other interactions in mind, I developed Textual Healing, a mindfulness-based app that includes a guided audio reflective practice aimed at increasing people's awareness of their thoughts, feelings, and intentions before sending a message. The practice asks them to visualize the intended recipient of the message, to imagine the person opening the phone, see the expression on their face, their body language, and then to think about their own needs and their relational goals and desires, at least those that are consciously accessible. Essentially, it aimed to use technology to offer a, dare I say it, therapeutic experience that cultivates the very qualities that technology tends to inhibit in us: awareness of self and other, reflective functioning, the capacity for intimacy. And the exercise did, in fact, affect people's messaging. They tended to be more vulnerable, self-aware, compassionate, constructive, and relational. For example, one person changed, "Why did you not show up? You are a fool," to "Why did you not show up? I'm disappointed." Another changed, "I do not want to deal with you anymore. You are toxic," to I feel that our relationship is suffering, and I feel a need to disconnect. Let's talk about it. I remember the mixture of surprise and tenderness that I felt upon reading these messages. These were people I'd never met. They weren't my patients. We hadn't spent hours together processing their relational patterns and identifying how they play out in the present. And yet here they were, seemingly able to be more honest with themselves and others about their needs, all prompted by some pre-written questions and comments delivered via an app. But underneath these feelings, I had a sense of unease. I talked about the app at research conferences, but avoided any mention of it in psychoanalytic circles. Was I engaged in an act of professional betrayal? Was I undermining my craft? What would my analytic supervisors think about my turning hours of intense clinical training into sound bites? Wouldn't this be seen as subversive, really as a problematic alternative to analytically oriented work? But was it an alternative? I didn't think so, but I worried that I was being naive. This was some years before CBT chatbots started to become popular using rule-based AI, and long before we were faced with the question that haunts many of us sitting here. Will today's generative AI and large language models, bots and voice assistants, and tomorrow's super intelligent AI radically change people's relationship to therapy and therapeutic interventions? 15 years ago, most of us, myself included, were convinced or convinced ourselves that those possibilities were at worst very far off, the stuff of science fiction. I retrospectively suspect that my interest in applying technology to clinical issues created a kind of split that left part of me feeling quite uncomfortable. On one level, I was playing with technology's capabilities, exploring how it could be used to enhance communication with self and other. Yet even then, I turned away from parts of technology that felt threatening. I embraced my inner Luddite. I stayed away from social media and the other technologies that I study and write about. And until this morning, I had avoided playing with OpenAI. And I'm a bit afraid to admit that publicly in front of all of you, given my conviction that it is precisely this sort of phobia that contributes to a quiet denialism in our field and is likely to contribute heavily to our own demise. But we have to all start somewhere. A few years ago, Todd Essig recruited me and a student of mine to conduct a study on a CBT bot called Wobot. This AI-driven bot therapist was quickly being adopted by companies looking for cheap alternatives to mental health. Todd noted some deficiencies in the study design and methodology that were being used to promote its effectiveness in reducing depressive symptoms. Our findings did not replicate the original findings, showing that Wobot is superior to any form of treatment as implied in the original study. Notably, no study has even attempted to do such a comparison, despite the fact that it is widely accepted that an RCT comparing actual therapies is the most obvious and perhaps the only way to assess that question. Interestingly, though, our findings suggested that people who talk to Wobot may have improved less in their anxiety and depressive symptoms than those who talk to Eliza, a non-smart bot built in the 1960s that mirrors what a person says in a Rogerian-inspired style. Whew, I felt relieved. AI doesn't replace humans after all. But wait, did I really think it could? Had I lost faith in the in-person therapeutic endeavor? Had I lost track of what I know to be uniquely human about what we do and the inherent benefits of that? Have we all lost track of that? Also, would these findings even matter when up against a company representing a multi-billion-dollar industry that aims to replace human therapists with bots and real empathy with the show of empathy? Our findings came out at the exact same time as ChatGPT became publicly available. And it was hard not to feel discouraged by the uneven competition between psychoanalysis and analytically informed research and the technologies that threaten to undermine it, often driven by perverse incentives to capitalize on people's pain rather than support a deepening of their self-knowledge. For me, and I suspect for many others, resisting digital technology is embedded in our strong conviction that the analytic endeavor is superior, not only to other treatment modalities, but certainly to anything driven by AI. On a less conscious level, though, I suspect that our phobic responses to the invasion of AI into the clinical domain reflect our unconscious attempt to avoid deep existential fears about our own replaceability, or, as Dr. Bosatti just explicated so well, our fear of death. The consequences of our having turned away from this reality are significant. By placing ourselves in opposition to technology, we both avoid and are protected from facing the implications of the AI revolution. An obvious example is our embrace of doing therapy through a screen, especially here in the States. Before COVID, we used the screen as a good enough, but not great, alternative to in-person work. But COVID changed that. Now, recognizing the convenience and efficiency of working on screen from home, we abandoned many of our earlier concerns. Many closed their offices altogether. Increasingly, we were pulled to sidestep, even negate our hesitancies about screen work. We stopped thinking about the screen's limitations. We avoided wondering, for example, if the absence of mutual gazing undermines right brain benefits of psychotherapy on procedural and implicit relational knowing, something which dominated our minds and theories just a few years earlier. In a recent paper, Molden presents a 5-point spectrum of therapy delivered by humans, level 1, to therapy delivered by robots, level 5. When I read that video-mediated therapy is a level 2, a step away from what we view as fully human, I was taken aback, which is particularly strange given my own critical position of video-mediated therapy. But even for me, and I imagine for others, this distinction is simply at odds with the felt experience of our own very human flesh and blood while seeing patients through a screen. And yet one frequently hears analysts describing how different transference-based work in particular can be over the screen. Our inability to grapple with these apparent contradictions makes it harder to recognize when we ourselves are sliding away from humanity and towards the automated. AI turns the volume up to a new level. Its approximation of human consciousness makes it far more unsettling than previous technologies. But it forces us to reckon with what is essential about being human, what can and cannot be replicated by artificial intelligence. There are attempts to mimic the experience of empathy and compassion and to tap into clinical decision-making, knowing what to say when. Many people believe that AI can replicate our cognitions and interventions, but better. For example, without the possibility that the human clinician will sometimes perform more poorly than AI. For example, when sick, tired, or preoccupied, not to mention poorly trained. But of course, so much is missing. Our decisions are guided by a multiplicity of phenomena: unconscious conflicts, attachment dynamics, trauma and countertransference, not to mention basic human emotion. These things are uniquely human, but as AI evolves, our appreciation and understanding of these forces may shift in ways that are hard to predict. Many clinicians are uncomfortable engaging this conversation without hitting up against dissociation or splitting. While other fields are working hard to further blend human and machine-based intelligence, most clinicians roll their eyes and scoff at the possibility that a large segment of the population will choose a cheaper and non-human version of us. As long as our offices are filled, we turn away from that very real possibility. This denial extends to other aspects of AI. We are far more disturbed than empathic when we learn about efforts to clone a loved one so that they can continue to exist and provide comfort after death, despite our ability to understand that wish. Similarly, we appreciate, even enjoy, technology's promise of never-ending abundance, the fantasy that everything is within reach. But these fantasies make us anxious. We criticize the use of AI to avoid experiences of loss and separation. We judge its emphasis on instant gratification and its negation of the need to help people self-regulate. These critiques are not without merit, of course, but when we judge from afar, we prevent the psychoanalytic endeavor from participating in the conversation. The conversation about AI is nothing less than a conversation about what it means to be human and why it is important to even retain a focus on that question. As I often remind myself, the rhetoric of AI is not the reality of AI today. The dystopian narratives and imagined future that dominates conversation about AI frightens us, analysts included. Those anxieties create a tendency to split and reify the binary between AI's potential for good versus evil. But AI's terrifying promises are a fantasy compared to the actuality of OpenAI tools and the metaverse, which, while compelling and easily capturing of our attention and fantasies, are also clunky. They do strange things like making inappropriate passes at us. They cannot smell flowers or feel madness or feel sadness. They don't have a past or a family or a tribe. They are not social. They are often inaccurate and give inconsistent and bizarre responses. We don't know how AI will change the future or our understanding of what it means to be human. but we must explore how AI can be used to shift subjective experience. For example, might an AI-generated companion offer something of value to a lonely, socially avoidant patient? We must appreciate that it can, while also being aware of the exploitative elements of these companionship bots, those which are programmed by bad actors to take advantage of a patient's loneliness, to upsell them on the next set of features. These are things we actually need to know about. It is a new arena of competency. We must be able to recognize the ways that AI can be used as a tool to support our patients and even our own understanding of analytic work, while also being tuned into the cost. A capacity to tolerate, even appreciate uncertainty is at the heart of the analytic endeavor. In our clinical encounters, we aim to embrace the state of not knowing, to remain curious and open. When we get uncomfortable, we try to understand and analyze our reactions so they don't prevent our continued engagement. If we can imagine for a moment AI as a patient, perhaps it will be easier to internalize the need to respond with humility to the way it challenges the limits of our understanding. It is our responsibility to make lots of space for the anxieties and fears it generates, both real and imagined. Our AI patient is the one who will keep us up at night, the one we have to work hard to keep up with because it is changing so fast. If we fall prey to the insecurities that AI creates in us, we will remove ourselves from having an impact on its future. There are grave dangers to abandoning what is easily one of the most important conversations in society today, and we need to step up. Thank you.
Wow. I feel ready for engagement in so many different areas. Thank you, Dr. Trub. And I also feel challenged to deal with my own avoidance and phobic responses, which are many. These are terrific papers to my mind, and there's a lot of associations and questions. I just want to remind all of you that now is the time that you could start to pose your questions and associations into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will hold on to those and start gathering those while we engage with the panelists, while I pose some questions with the panelists and have them discuss amongst themselves for a few moments, and then we will entertain your questions. So my first question is really, wow. You each spoke a little bit about various challenges with AI, challenges that we have that are concrete, challenges in our fantasies, challenges to truth, challenges to our theories, challenges to our professional practice. Psychoanalysis, with its unique emphasis on the unconscious, may have something to contribute to each of these challenges, I believe. And we may be specially positioned to support these discussions that happen beyond discussions that are just in our field. So we're right now having a conversation with the IPA. Probably most of us are analytically inclined. I can't imagine there are others that are joining us today. That said, do we have a responsibility or a way to engage beyond our profession with these questions and help others understand the way we think about metapsychological concerns? What do you think? And anyone can answer. We're going to dialogue with each other. So this is your chance to engage with your colleagues and with me.
I mean, Laura, in my mind, it's like you should go first on this one, right? I think you have a lot to say on this. But I'll limit my comments so others can speak as well. I think your question, Dr. Zapian, is absolutely marvelous. Yeah, like what is our responsibility as analysts or analytically minded folks? What can we bring to other fields that are actually investigating the question of AI or engaging with it, right? And I think Dr. Posati's work is in line with that in many ways as well. So if anything, the first thing that actually comes to mind is that when I hear stuff in the mass media, which is all the time, about artificial intelligence, the model of the mind that they have implicitly in whatever discourse is a very simplistic, basic model of the mind. It's essentially a CBT model, right? In which there is no trace of the unconscious at all. It's all on the surface. In other words, what you see is what you get, and there's nothing else here, folks. That's the idea of how the mind is actually presented, the implicit model of the mind that's in these kind of discourses. If anything, I think as analysts, what we can bring to the table is the psyche And the social itself, because of the psyche, is vastly more complex than this, right? That's why I said in my paper, I don't agree with this idea that AI is intelligent the way we are, right? Because it's not. It does not have an unconscious. And second, the idea that it can awaken or be conscious, at least to my mind, is a delusional one. But it's not delusional if you hold this basic CBT model of the mind in place. If you actually have that model in place, we're reaching a point very quickly where artificial intelligence does equate with human intelligence. But of course, as analysts, we know there's a lot more. And so I think we can bring that to the table in a major way. And I say this from personal experience. So I've been contacted and recruited by AI outfits in the Valley, in Silicon Valley, for this, to consult on this sort of thing. And I don't do that really ethically. I just don't want to be part of that. However, I did allow it in 2 instances precisely to bring this forward, which is, hey, there's a lot more here than what you guys think, right? And it opened up some real avenues of possibility. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Any
I'll
other
jump
comments?
in
Yeah.
with the introduction. I guess where it sends me is that I think that we're very insular as a field. I think part of the reason we have been so slow to adopt technology is because of that. It really hits up against a lot of our tendencies to hide and to avoid vulnerability. I think that and I think there's good reason, for example, to be uncomfortable with the never-ending amounts of information that people put out on the internet, and we don't tend to want to do that. And it all makes sense, but I think the effect of it is that we stay over here and the world continues. And I think that it's only become more and more imperative that we bring what we have to bear to all of these kind of realities, which really are quite threatening to the things that we hold most dear. I'm actually associating I remember listening to your podcast, Dr. Zapian, and I don't remember who you were talking to, but you were sort of balancing, I think, the ethical concerns about talking about our patients, which I think we have understandable and always have understandably been very precious about. We don't want to we hold them very dear, and we don't want to talk about our work in a way that I think will create a feeling of objectification in them. But I think we are so concerned with those. We're much more concerned with those kind of ethical questions than we are with the ethical question of what we need to be contributing to these wider conversations. And I really think we are at a inflection point where we can't continue to remain isolated and sort of looking in at ourselves. We really have to be a part of the conversation. There is, as I think you pointed out on the podcast that time, that it is an ethical imperative that you are driven by to get on and do something that's going to reach a wider audience, our patients.
Interesting.
Can I just a quick follow-up? I'm not a psychoanalyst, so I can give you an external view, but this is a very interesting point in the sense that in the literature about the philosophy of technology, design, science and technology studies, ethics of artificial intelligence, there is nothing about unconscious. There is a kind of repression of the unconscious and the problem of the unconscious, of course. And this is very interesting on the one hand, because the real question should be, why do human beings want so much be like a machine? I don't think this is a secondary question. But on the other hand, there is a real lack in the literature, there is a real lack in the debate. This question is undermined. And so I think it's one of the responsibility of psychoanalysis today is to bring about the unconscious, the question about the unconscious, to reformulate the question about the unconscious in another context, that is the technological context.
Wonderful. I have another question. I wanted to ask what you all thought about the problem of the body as it relates to AI. So AI has sensors. We have a far more sophisticated understanding of sensory input, and in particular with child development, you know, the skin envelope and mother-infant communication and so on. We have a little bit more theoretical understanding of the importance and centrality of the body, the skin, the sensory world, the aesthetics. I so far don't believe that AI really can replicate that through these sensors that give feedback loop and, you know, all the kinds of sight things that we see in self-driving cars and whatever. It's not the same. That said, our metapsychological models tend to have this kind of mind and brain, at least, and a little bit with the body. What can we say about the centrality of the body, or the importance about us theorizing more about the body's role in our psyches, as it compares to how AI is developed or developing? You know, the missing body seems to me to be important. You can disagree with me, maybe that's not the case, but what do you think?
I can jump in. I think a lot about this because I write a lot about working through a screen, and so I've thought a lot about it in that context. But my association with when we talk was to a recent example that was that I was exposed to of a woman who had lost a child and had created, using AI, had created some sort of I think it looked like her child. It didn't obviously have a corporal body, but in order to kind of work through some, I mean, probably Dr. Fossati would know a lot more about the kind of technology of it. But anyway, engaging with this kind of recreated image of her child, and wanted to ask for forgiveness, had felt like she hadn't spent enough time with her. Anyway, very, very evocative and upsetting example, and sort of fell onto the child to ask for forgiveness, and actually like fell through her body as it was described. I mean, there was other, I think, really fascinating parts of that around like being given forgiveness and then having that resolution, but pseudo resolution, of course, and all that went with that. But the image for me of falling on the fantasy of the body, and thinking a little bit about, you know, sort of like just the projections and fantasies and how powerful they are, and then these like moments where we hit up against them, I think are so, it's like we need the moments where we hit up against them. One of the things I've written about is my own pregnancy while being on Zoom, and it's the difference between being in the room where people could kind of interact with my changing body, and then the kind of, you know, its disappearance in the second treatment, and how the absence of that was so disturbing, because sometimes it just never was confronted, right? To have a whole therapy that, you know, didn't confront it. So I think there's these, I guess I just think about these moments where like the actual and the fantasy kind of have this rupture between them, as illuminating something about like what we are missing that we are often not aware of, that we need to be like much more tuned into. Anyway, a lot of thoughts, but I'll pause there.
Thank you, Dr. Tripp. So I'm very glad you asked this question, Dr. Zapian, because at least in the way that I understand psychoanalytic practice, it's all about the body entirely, right? And I think that happens, or that's the case across the board with the different traditions in our field. So certainly as a Lacanian analyst, it's all about the body. It's all about the body and language and the body in certain very specific ways. But that same sort of way of thinking, or something akin to it, exists in most of the other traditions as well. So, I mean, I would begin answering this question with that observation. I think what's also really interesting is that in the theorizing about where AI is going, the people raising the alarm, kindred spirits to myself in this case, what they will oftentimes say is that the lack of a body for AI systems is an actual danger because it does not impose a limit, right? In other words, it can just do whatever it wants, and it's not held down by a kind of material reality in the way that we are. I think that's an important point. And if we bear that in mind, I think it points to something else, which is that our bodies are the way in which we psyche. If I were to verbize that word, make it into a verb, that's how the psyche actually functions, right? Is as a set along with the body. And okay, what am I saying with that? I mean, to give a concrete example, I get up this morning, I'm weary, my body's tired, right? It's the end of a long work week. I've worked with a lot of patients. Now, why am I saying that? Because that actual lived experience of my body is actually a kind of mentalization, to use that kind of word. It is part of what we actually do. It allows for certain kinds of subjectivity and does not allow for other kinds of subjectivity. In other words, we have to deal with the body. We have to deal with the body as available, open, productive, energized. We also have to deal with the body when it's not in those states. And that is part and parcel of how psychoanalysis actually works. So to not have the body present, right, and in some sort of therapeutic interaction, to me, misses the point of the whole endeavor of psychoanalysis. And then as a last point, perhaps, I think what also gets lost in it is the body of the analyst, right? So I very much like to work in person. I do not like to work online or over the phone, although I do. Why? Because we live in a transient society. It's very difficult to have an entire practice in person, but the vast majority of my practice is in person. And to me, it's remarkable how, let's say, if I've worked with somebody for some period of time over the phone, to then have them come into the office and have to contend with me in terms of my embodied presence in the room changes everything. And that having to contend with the body of the analyst is part of the actual analysis, right? Particularly, in particular diagnostic categories, to call it that. If somebody's more obsessive, there's already a wholesale effort at trying to actually deny the existence of the analyst themselves. These kind of technologies actually facilitate that kind of denial. Working in person and them having to deal with the actual body of the analyst in the handshake, the breathing, right? Maybe the scent that's in the room when they come in from a previous session, that sort of thing. The corporeal aspect of it is something that's essential to analytic practice, and I would certainly want to maintain.
Any other
So, thank you so much for this question. I think I agree with with the other speakers. The question of the body is very, very important, and this is also another interesting aspect in the literature, in the how to say, in the rhetoric about AI. There is a completely, from my point of view, there is a conception of the mind which is completely detached from the body. The body doesn't exist, basically. There is this kind of concept called infosphere, which is a concept relaunched by many different philosophers and authors, according to which basically the mind is just a string of numbers, one and zeros. So the contact with the flesh, the body, it's absolutely absent. It's not important. And I think that psychoanalysis is important also because it reminds us that our brain, our mind is always an embodied mind, and the connection with the body is essential, is the first thing. And this is also another, there is also another interesting point, the question of the body, how to say, resurfaces in the interaction with robots, because robots actually have, how to say, a body in a, of course, in a completely different sense, but it's a body with which we can interact. Just the last point, I think another interesting aspect is the question of the sex robots based on AI and how they can change the experience, the sexual experience.
You know, it's interesting what you're saying brings to mind biotechnology and I don't know if this is happening the world over, but at least in the San Francisco Bay Area, there are lots and lots of people who are having children much later, and almost all of them are freezing their eggs followed by IVF at
Yeah.
very late ages, and it's entirely engineered, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
this desire to control sexuality, maybe control the birth process, maybe control women even in this whole, you know, kind of underlying this entire denial of the body. So I find
Yeah.
it fascinating in some ways, and maybe potentially dangerous. We haven't yet seen what happens when everybody has babies in this particular way. And the early stage data suggests that some of those children are having increases in, you know, ADHD, autism, et cetera, because they're all late stage mothers and so on, and precarious births. Anyway, fascinating. I want to turn our attention now to some of the questions we've received from the audience. There are many. We're going to start with this. The first one: if our reality becomes more like a dream, then transference and what's underneath may become the focus. Could you elaborate on how you've connected the transferential relationship with the confusion about what's true that AI-generated knowledge creates? And I think this question most directly relates to Fernando and his talk. Although anybody...
Yeah, right. Yeah, I would welcome, you know, both of the other panelists to speak on this as well. I don't know if I'm understanding the question exactly, but I do understand it as if I could elaborate more on what I said earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'll connect it actually to something I've already been noticing for years and that other authors and myself have actually written about, which is growing up in the kind of social fields that we grow up in now. There's something quite different occurring than what happened previously. Okay, so just to give a basic example of this, when I was growing up, it was quite common to hear from my parents direct commentaries about my character, right? In relation to some sort of like behavior that I had engaged in, right? So, for example, if I did a certain thing that I wasn't supposed to, as children tend to do, I would be told not only, hey, you're not supposed to do that, right? But hey, be careful. This is maybe an aspect of your character that you need to be careful about, right? Because it can lead you to this sort of thing. So it's a discourse to me about me, right? And I internalize it. It's a way of defining my character over time, right? Whether it's accurate or not, in some ways, is kind of immaterial. The discourse and in the investment by the parent in the child in that way, right, indicates a certain kind of thing. And the very particular thing is that the big other in Lacanian terms is actually directing its speech towards you and says something to you about you. This is incredibly important to receive as a child. What I've noticed in the last couple of decades is much less of that. In fact, a real inhibition on the part of parents to speak to children in this way, right? Okay, now I grew up in a Latin American context. So you might think, well, this is just a culturally inscribed kind of thing. No, because I've asked people from many different cultures around my same age or older, and they were like, oh, it's very common to get that kind of discourse sent my way by parents, by teachers, by principals, by adults in general, right? Okay, now what I'm encountering with my younger analysins nowadays, people coming in their 20s, let's say, is that they receive very little of this, very little pronouncements by the big other about something having to do with their character or who they are in the world. And this lack of discourse or speech on the part of these figures in their lives means that they come in with very little direction in terms of how to address this big other that has not spoken to them. Okay, the reason I'm bringing all this up is because once somebody enters into analysis, they finally have a chance to interact with a representative of the big other, namely us as analysts, in a very particular way. And what I notice is that the transference in those cases is much more intense, and it has much more of the taste of the repetition compulsion that the transference is in a certain kind of way. It has that in a much stronger way. The analyses are longer in nature because they have to then work through all that, right? Okay, so I'm giving that as a kind of precursor to answering this question, which is, if we think of the basic formula that I'm putting on the table, you have these changes in the social field that have real impacts in the subjective arena, right? Particularly in analytic practice. And I just got through detailing one, right? This lack of discourse by the big other then leads to a certain kind of rudderless lack of direction that people then have to work through. Okay. In terms of AI and the transference issue here, if you're in a social field in which you cannot rely on, in terms of accuracy, you cannot rely on what's being told to you by anything that's infused with AI, because AI is so incredibly inaccurate. And then when you finally do have a chance to create a connection with something or somebody you do trust, it will become rigid and super concrete. That's what I'm getting at, is that all of a sudden the transference, as opposed to being like a way station, right? Like a medium-term vehicle that allows you to get somewhere, becomes the end all. It's everything, right? Analysis start hanging on to your every word as if it were scripture. And that does not bode well for psychoanalysis, right? Because in the end, they need to deconstruct us so they can actually construct themselves. But that becomes incredibly difficult in a situation like this.
I'm open to others commenting, but we have a lot of questions. So I'm wondering if does anybody have anything that they'd like to add? Okay, thank you. The next question, what opportunities or responsibilities are there for psychoanalysts to shape the development of AI to be safer or better for the mind?
I mean, my thinking is that a lot of our work could be on the side of working with lawmakers and policymakers around limiting where and how AI can be used in different contexts, particularly with vulnerable populations. I think we can appreciate the ways that it can support people, but really, really be mindful of those who don't have the capacity to think through the costs. Just say that.
Has the capacity to think through or not think through? I don't know.
Great.
It's a good question, but I agree with you. Are there other thoughts?
Well, I think there are a lot to do in the sense that there are a lot of discourses today about the ethics of AI and responsibility, transparency, privacy. So, and there are no basically or just few psychoanalysts who work on this, and so it would be very important to bring what psychoanalysis can give to this kind of discourses, to bring this to the ethicists, designers, programmers, all these people who are not aware of certain kind of questions.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to another question. Will dead bots not unnecessarily extend the mourning period as they make it more difficult to separate libido from the lost object? Will we be stuck in mourning if we all have these dead bots?
I guess it's for me.
Maybe, yes, or maybe anyone. Yeah.
No, I was joking. That's a big question. I actually have no answer. My first answer would be yes. It it can prolong the period of mourning, but I don't know, maybe it can enrich also our experience of mourning. It's not just technology has not just negative effects, I think. I don't know. I'm still studying this kind of phenomena, so I have not
You should come with a companion psychoanalyst to help determine is this a
absolutely.
mourning process or one that's being enriched.
I want to jump in and say, I think this is a good example of the kind of, like, we have our theories and they're so helpful in thinking through where the dangers are likely to be. But how can we also remain open to the kind of possibilities of what we don't know? And I think it's just, it's so hard, especially when it, triggers our discomfort.
Yeah. Would anybody be able to think through an example of projective identification from one machine to another? You had that on one of your slides, Dr. Posati, and that was fascinating as a concept.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, it's a very good question. Projective identification from machine to machine.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting question because think about biases in algorithms, algorithmic biases. I interpret those algorithmic biases as forms of projective identifications. And then transmissions of this kind of contents, not just from humans to machine, but also from machines to machines.
Wow.
Of course, this is just an hypothesis, but think about, for example, high complex neural networks, very complex AI systems that are able to elaborate billions of data in just a few seconds. I think it's a serious question we have to reflect on now because it will be a problem in the future. Because if these machines are able to communicate more and more between themselves, remind that the 90% of communication process all over the world are made by machines today, by algorithms. Our entire financial system is managed by algorithms and AI systems. So what are the unconscious contents that we are able to project on these machines and how this machine can transform and transmit these contents? Algorithmic biases is just one example, but there are a lot of other examples. You can see also this very banal example is the use of ChatGPT and the effects of ChatGPT in research. A lot of data are fake, are basically simulation made by the machine. I don't know. So it's just an hypothesis.
What do you all think? Is that projective identification or is that replication? The first step from us projecting onto the machines, that's clear. But the replication of the algorithmic biases further to another machine seems to me to be something different. I don't know. Does anyone want, does that seem like a projection? Or is that a replication or a, I'm not sure. What do you think?
I'm not sure.
We're all not sure.
I interpret this as a projection, but of course we can think about it. We can discuss.
When I hear projective identification, I think the unconscious. I mean, the unconscious has to be present. So I don't exactly know how it would occur in strict analytic terms, right? How it would occur from machine to machine. However, I think Dr. Posati's question on this and his emphasis on this is absolutely right. Either we ask these questions and we kind of start providing some answers, or somebody else will later down the line, and this has to be asked. I think one way in which I find the question interesting is what are our fantasies about that actually, right? Because our fantasies regarding a machine engaging in a process of a projective identification vis-a-vis another machine inevitably brings up our own fantasies about this kind of stuff, right? And so that itself is really interesting. And I think it connects to a question you asked before, Dr. Zapian, from the audience. Having, you know, like the status, right, of what we are in this whole process, I think, is at stake. Part of what I'm saying here is that as part of our fantasies having to do with the machine, we've attributed all kinds of things to the machine, right, that we might not actually like. That's part of it, right? It's an easy vessel that we can sort of throw all kinds of stuff into that we actually don't want to own for ourselves, right? So there's a kind of splitting that occurs there. And I think it's actually useful. We do this with many other things, not just AI technologies, but many other kinds of technologies, including very rudimentary ones that we're very used to and we don't have any concerns about. We do this all the time, right? So when we start thinking about a machine-to-machine projective identification process, I think inevitably we're bringing up our own fantasies. And that you can do in an actual session, for example, right? So going back to this whole thing about dead bots and how they might prolong a process of mourning, perhaps unnecessarily, well, I think there's somebody working with a dead bot or a grief bot directly, and then there's somebody working with a dead bot or a grief bot, and then including that in their analysis, which is what would happen with anything else, right? There's a difference between somebody partying with psychedelics and having some sort of epiphany, right? And then doing psychedelics and then bringing it into the actual session, right? Where it gets examined, it gets analyzed. These are two separate processes, right? So even though, as you can well tell, my general stance towards AI is not a favorable one by any stretch. I have a very deep and hardcore critique. My dissertation back, I don't know, it was like nearly it's like 15, 16 years ago. It was called Digitizing the Psyche, Human Nature in the Age of Intelligent Machines. And so I've been thinking about this for a very long time, right? I think we have to bear those things in mind, that we can actually, you know, even myself, I'll be the first one to say, you can include these kind of processes in the analysis itself, right? It's just more grist for the mill. But I think it's important not to be caught up in the thing in and of itself outside of the sphere of analysis.
Any other comment? No? So someone asks this question, can AI perform psychoanalysis? This question is unbelievably very popular every time I discuss AI with psychoanalysts. I find it an existential threat, but I'm really interested in the panelist's point of view. Will we have a Freud bot or an analyst bot anytime soon?
Well, actually, I worked for a company, and the company was trying to create basically an application based on Freud's metapsychology in order to interpret the dreams of the users. And it didn't work so well. So
What didn't work? Can you share? Do you know?
yeah, no, something about software interaction with the users, but it wasn't so useful.
Good. Anybody else?
I was hesitating because I feel like I really don't know what will happen. But I guess I was associating to recent market research, I think that done by Talkspace, or one of the companies, about like what do people want. And I think when they ask people, like just people what they want in their therapist, the things that I think we fear people want, which was 24/7 accessibility, being able to, you know, text my therapist, were way further down on the list than elements of than the things that we hold kind of dear and true to the sort of work that we do. I don't remember the specifics, but, you know, much more relational processes. And so I think the question for me is like, I think, yes, that will, I mean, something will happen and we will see what it is. But I think the bigger question is what will happen in terms of people's, the way that people relate to those bots. Will they really be seen as replacing what we do, or will they be in some ways adjunctive? I mean, you just brought up psychedelic, you know, like a psychedelic experience, it can be extremely therapeutic, and it can be even more therapeutic to come back and bring it into the analysis and talk about it. So, or bringing in a dead bot. I mean, these things, I think, you know, we have to wrestle with them, but you know, does our world, is it one of replacing, or is it one of adjunctive work in some way? Is one of the, I guess, the ways that I try to retain a sense of maybe hopefulness or openness when I go there to the place, you know, in the question.
So we have very little time left. I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to just add any general comments or speak more about something that you feel hasn't been addressed yet, or anything that's been kind of bubbling to the surface before we end.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to Dr. Prasati, Dr. Troop, Dr. Zapian. This has been really helpful for me to be able to think through stuff. And I think it has direct, you know, relevance for the clinic. And that's what I really appreciate. I think the one thing, you know, what I do here is us trying to grapple as a group with, well, how can we intervene on these questions? How can we intervene in the creation of AI? What can we bring from the world of psychoanalysis to these worlds that are producing AI? And I think that's a noble and worthy effort. And I would also hasten to add that we're not working with nonprofits here, right? There's a huge rush for market share, for a future market share on this that will determine whether, you know, some companies continue to be viable or not. Just to put it bluntly, right? There's a serious profit motive involved here, right? And so my concern also is having to do with that. When I've interacted with the Silicon Valley types, it's never been a situation where they were thinking in noble terms about things. In the end, they wanted to increase their profit margin, and they were trying to get me to provide them advice on actually how to do that. And I think we have to bear that in mind, that we're not dealing with sort of benevolent entities. They're thinking of the bottom line, and we need to bear that in mind.
Any additional comments?
Well, if I can add something, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you all the panelists. And yes, I agree with the last intervention. It's very important today to make designers and creators aware that the unconscious is an essential part of what we call the problem of control. And if we don't consider this problem, unfortunately, we won't be able to control our machines, to control our, and also to understand what we are creating.
Wow. There's some somber ending points. They kind of take us to a bigger scale and give me pause. I want to personally thank each one of you. Your papers are wonderful. This dialogue has been very stimulating. It's the beginning of what I hope will be a longer discourse that we have over the years, because I don't think any of these problems are going to get simpler. If not, they're going to speed up and intrude in ways that we can't yet foresee in the clinic, in the world, in our own homes, etc. I would like to, you know, I've enjoyed this. I hope that our listeners have enjoyed it. I hope everyone who listens later on YouTube also enjoys it. If you have questions and comments, you know, please continue to stimulate them and have them with your, you know, with your various communities and keep the discourse going. I'd also like to make you aware of our next upcoming webinar series. We will be hosting one soon on June 28th at 4 p.m. London time, same time. It's titled Music, Adolescence, and Psychoanalysis. The moderator is Rosa Spagnolo, and the panelists are Anna Cordioli, Massimo De Mari, and Monica Bomba. We have an entirely Italian team, which is unusual and wonderful given the topics, and we invite you all to sign up, and please join us for that event as well. Thank you again. Please join me with a big round of applause for our speakers. And please join us next time. Thank you.